Today's video is on the German invasion of Poland in September 1939. This is part of my summary of Chapter 2 of Alistair Parker's short history of the Second World War, which, as the whole chapter, deals with the conquests of Poland, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. That's 1939 to 1940. This is the basic chronology of events. We begin on the 23rd of August 1939 with the Nazi-Soviet Pact, also called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, by which the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany agreed to divide Poland between them. Then on the 1st of September, the German invasion of Poland began, and on the 17th of September, the Soviets invaded eastern Poland, which has extinguished any hope the Poles might have for survival. The Polish garrison in Warsaw capitulated on the 27th of September, which really marks the final defeat of the Polish state, and then the final surrender of the last Polish army units was on the 6th of October, 5 weeks after the invasion began. The Nazi-Soviet Pact is a major precondition for the German-Polish War, because it meant that Germany could proceed with its invasion and conquest of Poland without any worry that the Soviets might back the Poles. That's Molotov sitting at the center and Stalin behind him over his left shoulder. This is the map of the belligerents in 1939. So the dark grey area is Germany, with its newly acquired territories of Austria and the Czech part of Czechoslovakia. And then the red on the right is the Soviet Union, and then the yellow is Poland, caught between the two. And the map shows you the rough division of Polish territory between the two conquering states. And then in green we have the Allies on the west of France and Britain. Everywhere else is neutral at this point. The war begins. The war began with the German attack on Poland on the 1st of September 1939. The Germans wanted to conquer Poland quickly before the autumn rains made movement difficult, or the French could attack in the west. Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief in time of war, had promised a French attack on the 16th day of mobilization, and then the hope was that Polish resistance would enable French mobilization to proceed undisturbed. British and French strategists hoped that protracted Polish resistance would delay concentration of their armies, the German armies in the west, until the British Expeditionary Force was expanded and fully trained, but they feared that formal Polish resistance would only last 6 weeks to 3 months at the most, after which a guerrilla war in eastern Poland with Soviet aid might keep the war going. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, which was unknown, of course, initially to the French and British, removed that hope. In terms of army size, the basic point is that the Germans outnumbered the Poles. They had better trained troops, they had more modern weaponry, and the Poles, even at the best of times, would have had difficulty resisting them. The Germans employed a total of 55 divisions. Of these, 16 were fully mechanized. These were the best units and comprised only regular soldiers. Of the 16, 6 were panzer divisions made up of tanks with heavy and medium tank units and motorized infantry and artillery, and the other 10 were motorized infantry. The other 39 divisions marched on foot and consisted both of first wave infantry divisions with mostly regular soldiers and some reservists, and second and third category infantry divisions, again with capable soldiers. The Poles, on the other hand, had 30 regular infantry divisions plus 10 divisions of reserves. Their mobile forces comprised 11 brigades of horsed cavalry and one armoured brigade. The British had pressured Poland at the end of August to delay mobilization so as not to give the Germans an excuse to attack, so the reserve divisions were not ready in time. In terms of air power, the Germans had overwhelming air superiority with around 2,000 aircraft, all modern, against 600 Polish aircraft, mostly obsolete. Lacking any adequate early warning system, the Polish Air Force was largely destroyed early on in the war. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was able both to support German ground troops in their advance and attack Polish headquarters and communications. The German tactics were very effective. The task of the panzers was to break through the Polish defense lines and then make fast-moving attacks on lines of communication, supply and command. The 10 motorized infantry divisions would then rapidly consolidate the newly captured key positions. These tactics and these units were about to open a new chapter in the history of warfare. The slower moving infantry, the majority of the army, would then occupy ground and deal with pockets of isolated enemy troops left by the advancing panzers. The Poles were not able to mount an effective resistance to this type of German attack. They could conceivably have established defensive positions in depth to prevent an armoured breakthrough by the Germans, but remember that their mobile units were mostly horsed cavalry, so that is a major disadvantage. But the more significant factor is that Polish strategy was to defend the whole of its extremely long frontier from Slovakia in the south along the German border and up to East Prussia in the north, and conduct a fighting retreat from their advanced positions, holding on to territory as long as possible, especially in the manufacturing areas, until a French attack in the west could reduce German strength in the east. This meant there was no defense in depth, and it served only to make the German breakthrough and envelopment easier. The German progress was very rapid. Within 1 week, all except one of the defending Polish armies had been broken into separate fragments, and several Polish divisions had been encircled. When the only remaining Polish army counterattacked on the 10th, it was itself encircled. 2 weeks after the start of the invasion, most Polish fighting forces were contained in detached pockets, including one around Warsaw. After obstinate resistance, the Warsaw pocket finally surrendered on the 27th of September, and as I said earlier, some Polish units continued fighting until the 6th of October, but essentially in vain. One of the things which the book doesn't go into is the extent in this first of the German military advances in what becomes World War II, is the extent to which civilian targets were targeted right from the beginning. So here we have the western Polish town of Wajlun, I don't know whether that's the correct pronunciation, which was bombed and massively devastated, as you can see from these photographs, on the 1st of September, on the opening day of the invasion. It was an undefended city. Then the other horrific feature of the German advance is tactical, and that is the use of dive bombers to strafe civilian refugees to sow panic. So here we have a heart-rending photograph of a young girl and her, I assume, dead sister as a result of dive bombing strafing. Then as soon as the Germans had taken over almost, you started to have abuses of the civilian population. So I don't know the date of the first photograph on the left, but it was very early on. Teachers being marched towards an execution site, the Germans deliberately deciding to get rid of anyone who might possibly organize resistance to them. And then the other thing is the taking of hostages and executing them for any acts of resistance by the Polish population. So here we have an SS death squad about to execute civilians at Kornik on the 20th of October. So that's only 2 months after the beginning of the invasion. Now, any hopes that the Poles might have had to successfully resist the German advance were broken on the 17th of September, when, to their enormous surprise, Soviet forces advanced into Poland from the east. This shocked also the British and the French, because it became obvious that there was a prior German-Soviet agreement to partition Poland between them, the border partially following the River Bug. This had major strategic consequences. First of all, it meant that Germany would not have to keep troops in Poland to watch the Red Army, which gave Hitler a free hand in the West. Secondly, Germany could utilize Soviet supplies of minerals and raw materials, because the Soviet Union was essentially an ally rather than a neutral, and this seriously weakened any Allied naval blockade of Germany. Poland's rapid collapse and the new agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union called the whole Anglo-French strategy of delay into question. The Allied staffs had agreed that their ability to defend themselves from German attack would increase over time, whilst economic blockade, later followed by aerial bombardment of economic targets, would erode German power and morale. Hitler, they hoped, would then be overthrown by discontented Germans, with an Allied invasion as a last resort to topple a now enfeebled regime. Hitler himself seems to have agreed with the idea of time not being on his side. He wanted an early attack on France, suggesting the 12th of November 1939, less than 2 months after the fall of Warsaw, and sought to impose that idea on his generals, but the army resisted. In the event, the invasion was postponed 29 times over 6 months before its eventual date of the 10th of May 1940. The British and French strength did increase during this period, and faster than that of the Germans, but remember, the Germans were well in the lead. And in the first 6 months of 1940, Britain and France produced over 1,400 tanks compared to Germany's 558, whilst from January to May 1940, Britain and France together produced 6,794 aircraft, with the German production being half that figure, roughly. The British government and its military advisors continued to believe in a passive strategy of defense against German attack, with a reliance on blockade to make such an attack increasingly unlikely. The French, unsurprisingly, were less complacent. Cooperation between the Soviet Union and Germany would enable Germany to use its best units soon in the attack on the West, while Soviet aid made any blockade ineffective. Whilst Britain's land contribution to the defence of France was slowly increasing, Germany was growing stronger. Action was needed soon to avoid France being overwhelmed. The British thought that the Nazi-Soviet understanding wouldn't last very long, so the blockade would still be useful, and Germany wouldn't be able to overcome increasing economic problems. The British also had greater confidence in France's ability to defend itself than the French leadership, seemingly. The French political and military leaders made four proposals to Britain. One, stir up fighting in Southeast Europe as a distraction to the Germans and build up an allied force in Salonika in Greece to foster it. I should note that there was a French-led army in Salonika during much of World War One. Two, following the Soviet attack on Finland at the end of November 1939, with German acquiescence in accordance with the Nazi-Soviet pact, the Allies should support Finnish resistance. Three, bomb Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. Four, interrupt the supply of high-grade iron ore from Sweden to Germany. The British thought that interference in Southeast Europe was risky without Italian support, and also thought that it was better if Mussolini remained neutral, because if he was forced to make a decision, there was the danger that he might join Germany. Also, the British didn't want war with the Soviet Union, as they thought that the Nazi-Soviet cooperation wouldn't last. The French, however, thought that cooperation between the Soviet Union and Germany would last perhaps long enough to see the defeat of France. Anyway, the British didn't want to attack the Soviet Union or support Finland strongly. Finally, the French and British agreed to disrupt Swedish ore supplies. Using the excuse of sending aid to Finland, they proposed sending Allied troops along the railway from northern Norway to Sweden. These troops would then seize the Swedish iron ore fields to prevent exports to Germany. But then Finland surrendered to the Soviet Union on the 12th of March 1940, so the British and French agreed instead to lay mines in Norwegian territorial waters to block the ice-free route used by iron ore carriers going to Germany. If Germany then invaded Scandinavia, the Allies could seize the northern territories with their iron ore fields. Britain and France continued to bicker. There was also a major political change in France, with Renault, the man who was most opposed to Germany, replacing a resentful Daladier as prime minister. Daladier became defense minister, thus remaining in Renault's cabinet, with the divisions between the two men continuing. These political changes delayed the Norway plan. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without which these videos would never get made. And you're very welcome to support my channel. Please do like, comment and share on the videos if you will. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos, and I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Next week we'll talk about the invasions of Norway, Denmark, France and the Low Countries. That's from April to May 1940. Have a good day.